Hello, my friends. It's November, and this is another installment of Withe Stone Stories. I'm grateful to you for spending a bit of time with me. I'm your host, John Corbin Goldsberry, and as always, here to tell you a little bit more about life in our village. Now that the year's harvest is in, the countryside is quieter, but the farming year is not yet over. Dealing with the harvest is now the job of the day, and one hot spot of activity is now the mill, from which we get the flour for our breads, the grains for our ale, and for the farmers, their year's pay. I often stop by the mill to say hello to Andy, my friend the miller, and just to take in the atmosphere of the oldest and most grounded building in the village. Andy shared a story with me once that, well, this seems like the best time to share it with you. It's a tale of mystery and intrigue and, even better, love. It all centered on the mill, and with no wonder, for mills are magic. They are wood and water and stone and grain and movement. At the center of it all, the master magician, at 19 years of age, slim and in the full blush of youth, piercing blue eyes that shone like crystal and cut into the soul of whomever she saw, stood Rain Appleton. Her father, Anthony, the town miller, but she knew the mill as well as he, if not more so. Someday she knew she would fill the place at the Stones. She often did now, but then it would be official. She understood the magic of this place. She would listen and hear every peg of every gear and tell you its status. Every line and lever was hers to command. She understood precision and could feel the kinetic flow of nature move into, through, and out of the mechanism around her now. She reached out with her left hand above and just behind her head. The magician opened her palm and wrapped it around the wooden pole hanging from the ceiling above her. "Clear!" she bellowed out to all on the mill floor above her and waited for the reply. "Clear!" came the response from the unseen above, to signal that everyone had stepped back from the belts and pulleys. She brought the lever forward with practiced ease, and the engaging gear slipped into place. With a shudder, the mill sprang to life once more. It had been a minor repair, a loose peg on the face wheel that was causing the lantern gear to slip. A few blows with the maul remedied that. She knew, though, that if she had not been alert, it could have stress fractured and the mill would have stopped until it could be replaced. At the peak of grinding season, that would be a very bad thing indeed. Now, from my description, you might surmise that Rain was a bit of a tomboy, but you would be mistaken. Although she took after her father's Scandinavian blood, tall, blonde, and strong, she had the same fiery and confident demeanor as her French mother. She knew who she was and was firmly planted in her own life. A deep root, tapped into self. It was an unsettling trait for many of the village boys who, on the vestibule of their own adulthood, were still coming to grips with their own emerging awareness. They just got flustered and stumbled all over themselves when she gave them that bemused look. Perhaps she took a bit of perverse pleasure in this, but only a bit, for she generally liked people. Her mother, Angeline, was a town baker, having taken over the bakery from a series of prior bakers over the years, all the way back to the Morgan family. She, like her daughter, was headstrong, but with a wisdom that life of experience that her daughter had yet to discover. She ran the bakery and her vast staff of two with efficiency and punctuality of a clockmaker, yet she preferred the velvet glove over the iron fist. Today, she was outside her usual business, but not her comfort zone, helping with the annual mill rush when all the farmers have threshed the last harvest. She was one of those who could seem to give 100 people all individual attention at the same time. And that's exactly what the mill needed right now. The mill was the first real building in town if you didn't count the farmhouse next to it. There were plenty of farms scattered up and down the valleys and hugging the rills. Like most farms, the Morgan family had a hand mill for their own use. There comes a time, however, that the grain fields got bigger and a soul's wrists and elbows just failed to keep up with the demand. Then you had to load all that grain onto the back of a wagon, hitch up the horses, and travel about a day's ride northeast to the nearest mill for grinding, wait your turn, and then another day's ride back. Some folks down the coast had an even longer run to make. So one winter, when the fields were frozen and one's minds tended to drift off to other diversions, Silas, patriarch of the Morgan family, jumped up from his fireside nap, grabbed some string and stakes from the shed, and began to plot out a spot by the river and draw up plans. Come spring, fresh oak was felled, French millstones ordered, and the wheel was built. The site was a buzz of constant activity the entire summer as stonemasons, timber framers, blacksmiths, and others worked up from the stone foundations to the slate roof. Gearing was constructed, belts and lines were cut and spliced, fittings and bearings were forged, the stream diverted, dams built, and at last the wheel was lifted into place. By fall, the first stacks of grain were stacked by the hopper, and the sluice lever was pulled for the first time. The whole building shuddered and shook as the mill sprang to life in a noisy display. But within an hour, the wood of the gears began to polish themselves down to a smooth and snug fit. The mill settled down to purr like a great cat, its peaceful demeanor lying the strength it harbored underneath. The opening was marked with great ceremony, speeches, kegs of cider and ale, a great groaning board of food for everyone in the surrounding area, and the craftsmen who built the mill, and a Morris team. There are always Morris dancers at such events, even though no one quite remembers why. Apparently there must be one, for who knows what calamity might befall the opening of a new establishment without them. And that said, a hogshead of ale given as payment was relatively cheap insurance. All these years later, the mill still purrs contentedly. Rain loved that sound. It resonated within her soul. That and the smell. If you could distill sweet grass, new-mown hay, a hot cup of tea, and fresh kneaded bread dough, that would kind of begin to touch the smell of the mill. It's warm and green and alive, a sweet dust that settles on you and claims you as part of the mill's purpose. You meld with it to the point that, should you go anyplace else in town, people will begin to drift towards you and smile often without even knowing why, as they react to the essence of the mill that travels with you. Now, it was a small mill as mills go, not like the great hulking stream-straddling mills of the Midlands, whose bulk shrouded the great paddle wheels beneath their skirts, but rather, having the advantage of verticality in their stream, was Overshot, powered by the sluice that ran down from the upper mill pond and mounted right there on the side of the field stove building for all to see and enjoy. Dependably, on any hot afternoon, you could stand, or squeal and jump as many of the town's children do, in the rainbow mist that billows out from the mill's underside, where the water empties into the lower mill pond before making its way down to the valleys to irrigate the crops below. It didn't take long for the Morgan family to realize they'd started something unplanned. Even with all the machinery whirring away, it was still easy enough to hold on a normal conversation at normal volume levels. Therefore, the mill quickly became the meeting spot for the local farmers. And often there were multiple conversations going on at the same time, each vying for attention over the other. The solution as they saw it was to build a mercantile just downstream on the trunk road, not only to supply the needs of the locals, but also to clear out the mill so the hapless miller wasn't forced to navigate around shifting islands of farmers discussing the latest designs for hen houses. This led to the coaching inn, So the more distant farmers had a place to stay overnight, which also meant a pub for food and drink. This led to a stable and a farrier to service the horses and wagons, and before you knew it, the Morgans farm was filled with shops and houses, and, well, they had diversified into a number of businesses. A generation or two later, the village was its own entity, and the Morgans and their affiliated families have divested themselves of many of their earlier ventures to concentrate on the Open Arms pub and coach house and the mercantile. The mill being passed down to other owners to arrive at Anthony Appleton, their father. Andy was a strong, clean-shaven, jovial and gentle soul who carried bags of grain around like pillows. His frame suggested he should be wearing Vikings Raiders clothes rather than his customary white smock, and, well, who knows, he could have an axe stashed somewhere just in case. He would sometimes allude to Rain that he was a wild thing in his youth, but was tempered by his marriage to Angeline Martin, the pretty baker down the street, who, with her delicate features and wry smile that said she knows more than she's letting on, made the two of them like a duet for tuba and violin. Thus Rain's lineage was meshed with the village itself, her father the stone, like the ones he worked over, and her mother the Withe, like the bounty of nature she baked with. That left her that point of magic in between, and this mill, that genesis of the village, was her familiar, her other half tied to her from birth. Her brother Elvin, on the other hand, was an enigma, more ethereal. He was not quite yet 14 and seemed equally at home in both the mill and the bakery, being able to jump in and lend a hand wherever, yet not quite touching either. He was also a child of the village, but his connectivity seemed less obvious. As brother and sister, they were quite convivial, never fighting and seldom arguing, but she felt he was some sort of changeling that the village itself had supplied, and thus living up to his name. For how could the two of them be so connected and so close, yet be so different? Yes, she was the magician, but he was the magic. He understood people like she understood the mill, and was quiet, aloof, and always taking everything in without judgment or undue action. She knew some people thought him a bother, maybe even slow, because he was always asking questions they felt were just obvious to them. Others found him disconcerting, like he was reading their thoughts. She knew better. Her brother spoke 3 languages that she knew of anyway, and sought to understand everything around him. He spoke of the nature of all things like they were one thing, and read everything he could get his hands on. Yet here he was now amongst the post-harvest rush, scoop in hand, filling bag after bag of fresh milled flour, smiling at everyone, even if they didn't smile back. She climbed the ladder back up to the bustling mill floor and stepped outside for a bit of air and light. There was a large assemblage outside, and her mother was passing around mugs of switchel, a drink made from cider vinegar, ginger root, honey, and water, oft referred to as haymaker's punch. She was also handling the business ends of things, keeping track of who had how much and where they were in line. She, of course, had a vested interest here as well, for as well as being the wife of the miller and co-owner of the mill, she was also the recipient of a portion of the grain ground, the usual arrangement for millers in lieu of cash. That portion was divided the flours, was sold directly on the mill's behalf, and the other sold to her bakery. She also bought flour directly from the farmers, so in this case, they were both her suppliers and her customers. Thus, the mill yard was more than a place to wait for your grain to be ground, but also served as a literal commodity trading floor. Deals were struck, bags of different grains were swapped, and many hands were shaken. Before the day was out, everyone here would have the whole next year secured for the welfare of their families. It was the way things had always been done, and no one saw any reason to change. It was simple, and it worked without avarice or greed. Everyone prospered, and should misfortune fall anyone in the village or the surrounding farms, the community was there to take up the slack. It was a very large, extended family. As rain stretched her shoulders in the warm autumn sun, her eye caught two new faces in the crowd. When you live in a small community, you treasured the novelty when it presented itself. She might not have noticed at all were it not for the younger of the two, a young man more or less her own age, who was in fact looking at her, at least until he realized she had caught his gaze, and he quickly averted his eyes and began apparently scanning the skies for interesting clouds. For some reason that made her smile. She watched him for a bit longer than she thought and caught herself continuing to glance his direction. The logical part of his brain kept saying, "Stop that." But the other part just wanted to keep stealing glances to see that he kept doing the same to her. The two sets of eyes kept this quasi-game of tag going for several minutes until a crowd of men moved between them and blocked their view. With her attention now diverted, much to the relief of her logic, she saw that he was accompanied by a woman Rain guessed was 30-ish, who was starting up a conversation with the locals and seemed to be shaking a lot of hands. New faces? She hadn't seen Elvin step up beside her. He seemed to have the ability to walk calmly and normally into a room, only to have people jump in surprise to find him there. He told her once it seemed like people only saw what they expected to see, and is called to their attention. Standing quietly and calmly in a space where people aren't expecting you apparently makes you invisible. "Yes," she replied, "and she seems to be doing business with the farmers. And the lad she's with keeps watching Mother. And you when you're not looking," he concluded. "So I see. Secrets and mysteries. Probably nothing, but if it makes you feel better, I'll see what I can find out." She nodded without taking her eyes off the woman. "Please." As Elvin slipped into the crowd, she turned to see her mother likewise slip into the mill, only to emerge a moment later and call out, "George!" across the yard. "You're up." She made a great sweeping motion with her arms, and then turned and disappeared back through the doorway. She was tempted to follow and see if her mother knew who these mystery people were or what they might be up to, but that would mean taking her eyes off of them and maybe discovering something important. And with Elvin off fact-finding wherever he went, she was on her own. She didn't normally feel suspicious about strangers, but this was different somehow. There was something in her mind that she couldn't quite grasp going on. It was like watching her mother do business, making deals for the bakery. This was a thought that rang little warning bells in her head. Bakery? As in another bakery? As in competing with her family business? And doing it here, right under their noses? She felt her emotions rise, a protective instinct she seldom had to deal with. "Okay," she thought to herself, "you don't know this. It's just speculation. Get the facts first before making a judgment." She sidled, for there was really no better word for it, over closer to the woman until she could overhear her bargaining with flour with Phil Humphreys. A lot of flour. Other than her mother, only Agnes and Abigail Martin, the sisters who ran the tea gardens and made cakes and scones, used anywhere near that amount of flour. Even the school, the inn, and the pubs tended to buy their breads from the family bakery. This woman was going into baking all right. When the woman rose from her seat and walked off, Rain turned her heel and glared at Phil with admonishment. "How could you?" She stormed off, leaving Phil looking very confused and with 2 raised palms. The thought of someone who had the audacity to come here, of all places, to be supplied out of her family for competing business made her livid. A second bakery was more than the town could support, and this would not end well for anyone. She thought about storming up to them and demanding they leave, but this only addressed the supply problems, not the competition one. She worked her way close enough to where the 2 interlopers were standing, and where she could catch bits of conversation. They were conversing in French, but she knew enough to pick up bits and pieces. Keep the secret. Win hearts. Opening next month. She couldn't take this plotting anymore. The reasonable thing to do was tell her mother everything. She would know what to do. So with fire trailing in her footsteps behind her, well, not literally, she stormed off into the mill in a blind determination, not allowing her to hear her brother coming up behind her shouting, "Rain, wait!" Her mother and father were both at the grindstones, with father at the hopper and mother bagging below. Phil and the other farmers were standing off to one side in a lively conversation that involved a lot of arm waving. "Mother," she shouted as she grew closer, "there's something you should know." Well, it took somewhere around 3 minutes of wild gesturing and exuberant orificating. She realized that her intention of consulting quietly with her mother had gone horribly awry. She had, in fact, told everyone in probably a half a mile radius. Her mother had a passively angry look on her face, with clenched lips and that gaze that could cut through solid rock. She gestured over her daughter's shoulders. "Do you mean them?" Rain steeled herself to her fate and slowly turned around. The 2 strangers were standing at the mill door. So was her brother Elvin, and everyone else in earshot, apparently waiting for the next act in the impromptu theater that was playing out before them. Undoubtedly, this would now be the topic of conversation for miles around in the foreseeable future. Rain could almost hear the sounds of knees being slapped and raucous laughter that would seal her reputation forever. Angeline Appleton, however, consummate diplomat that she was, graciously gestured for the 2 newcomers to step forward and address the assemblage in and around the mill door. "My dear friends and neighbors, I feel it is left to me, in the moment of my daughter losing all of her senses, to clarify the situation." She stepped around her daughter, who would later swear she had felt her skin scorch from the heat as she did so, to embrace the 2 strangers and turn them to face the crowd. "It seems I have been given by necessity the quite wonderful distinction of introducing 2 new residents to our community. Please make welcome Celeste Lebeau and her brother Robert." There was polite applause and a lot of indistinct mumbling from the farmers and families in attendance, for whom flowery speeches and ceremonies were not their usual fare, and left them somewhat flummoxed as to quite what they were expected to do next. Ignoring this, Angeline continued. "Well, up till now, we were all keeping a low profile as we had intended to stage a more formal announcement. However, it seems that ship has sailed." With this said, she turned to her daughter, who up to that moment believed she could not possibly turn an even brighter shade of red. She continued staring at the peg in the floorboard. "The Lebeaus approached the Merchants Guild last month as to the feasibility of opening a new establishment in the village, which we all enthusiastically endorsed. It is something our town has up to now lacked, and we believe will be of great interest to every villager at every age. We have helped her to procure the old Myers place on the dogleg of the Highland Road." Heads all bobbed up and down with more muttering, but much more interest. Phil apparently couldn't stand the suspense and called out, "Just stop beating round the bush, will you? A soul can't take all this speechifying afore lunch." Angeline smiled as laughter circled the room. "Well, as to that, it's not up to me to announce all the details. For that, I shall leave the podium, as it were," she gesturing to the platform on which the millstones were mounted, "to Miss LeBeau. If you would please." Both Angeline and her husband Anthony extended their hands to assist Miss LeBeau up to the higher vantage point for all to see. She looked around her for a moment while the muttering subsided. "Thank you all for indulging me. I dearly hope we shall be good friends and neighbors, and my brother Robert, and I hope to meet you all individually very soon. Please accept my apologies, for English is not my most fluent tongue, but I feel that will change quite quickly. Therefore, I will keep this brief and tell you that in a few weeks we shall be opening our doors to you with our brand new pastorie. We have spent time in your, our village, sampling the wonderful products from both Madame Appleton's bakery and the Martin sisters' fine cakes and scones, as well as Miss Molly's conserves, which, incidentally, I plan to make great use of. They are truly delightful. I'm digressing. I wish to convey that we strive to complement, not compete, with the delightful epicuria that you already enjoy." Someone in the crowd shouted out, "That means good food, Phil," which inspired another lap of chortles from everyone except Phil, who rolled his eyes and shook his head. We will be baking croissants, macaroons, eclairs, mille-feuilles, Queen Anne, and many other treats we hope you will find pleasing. We hope to see you all at our opening. Thank you." This got a rousing hand indeed. They helped her down again, and Angeline turned to Rain. "Now comes the apology, which I do hope is sincere and eloquent as your previous soliloquy." Rain opened her mouth to speak, but nothing seemed to be coming out. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then attempted again. She managed to rasp, feeling as red as the maple tree outside. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened to me. I'm never like that." "Well, almost never," her mother injected. She was pleased to see smiles all around her, but felt she still needed to explain. I jumped to conclusions. The wrong ones. I went from ignorance to anger at your expense. That was unfair to you and your brothers, and I beg your forgiveness." Celeste smiled. "All is forgiven. Your loyalty in defense of your family is commendable, if misplaced. But truth be told, this whole spectacle is better advertising than I could ever have hoped. Everyone will hear this story now." With the last line, she reached out and patted Rain on the cheek, along with a wink. Rain couldn't help but smile along. I really am sorry. When I overheard you talking about winning hearts and keeping secrets, I was convinced my suspicions were correct. I lost my sense of reason." "Actually," Elvin volunteered, "she was promising to keep Robert's secret about wishing to win your heart." All sound seemed to flee the room in terror as all eyes turned to Elvin. He in turn just looked at everyone back and said, "What?" Celeste looked at the boy incredulously. "I thought you were just one of the town boys. You speak French?" "Mais je suis. Oui, parle français." Elvin replied nonchalantly. Now everyone took turns alternately looking and not looking at each other for a moment. It seemed no one was quite sure where to go from here. "Not that I'm trying to hurry things along like," They all turned around to see Phil standing with his thumbs in his galluses. "But if you don't mind, why don't you leave these two Ludbirds to their own making and get back to grinding my wheat?" 2 weeks later, with great fanfare and, yes, Morris dancers, the Bella Matinee pastry opened its doors to what seemed like the entire village and several beyond that. Angeline Appleton was helping behind the counter, along with Robert and Rain. Elvin and his father Anthony were happily sitting on the curb munching hot buttered croissants. Elvin looked across the street and through the window at his sister and Robert working next to each other. "They seem like they belong together, don't they?" Anthony said softly. "Do you know his full name means bright and beautiful?" "I think that sounds right. She picked well." Anthony smiled and looked at his son. "I think you're right as rain." He turned back to join Elvin, looking at the young workers. "Yes, I couldn't wish for more." Now, I don't know the future, but I have high hopes for these youngsters. I think the future of the village is in good hands with the generations to come. It is they who are making their entrance to strut the stage as we are making our exits. And with these chapters in, the next one is being written. It's the tale of us, our dreams, our music, and our laughter goes on.